Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. Nearly 60,000 people are being housed in New York City's homeless shelters each night. 23,000 of them are children. Each day, thousands of New Yorkers and many thousands more across the country show up at food pantries and soup kitchens to keep from going hungry. Instead of solving the tragic problems of poverty, hunger, and homelessness, we seem to have accepted these dismal, painful conditions as permanent features of the American landscape. Can't anything be done? Are poverty and homelessness inevitable? Is anyone at fault? We'll talk about this with my guest, the Reverend Glenn Chalmers, an Episcopal priest who runs one of the city's busiest soup kitchens at the Church of the Holy Apostles in Manhattan. Father Glenn, how are you?
Fine.
Good. Thank you so much for coming by. I appreciate it. I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and it seems that I'm seeing more and more people sleeping outside, sleeping, on the streets and in doorways in all kinds of weather. Why, after all these years, do we still have such an enormous problem with poverty and homelessness in this country?
When we opened in 1982 with the soup kitchen, it was supposed to be a temporary solution to a temporary problem. We thought we'd be there for a few years, and here we are 33 years later, still serving over 1,000 meals. I think it's due to a lot of
1,000 meals each day?
Each day, every weekday.
Yeah.
I think it's due to a lot of factors, lack of affordable housing, lack of access to good medical care, mental health, people getting unemployed or having very low wages. It's a lot of contributing factors.
One of the things that struck me, as I mentioned, is that we seem to have grown pretty callous or indifferent about this. Why do you think there's not more of an outcry? Why aren't people more upset at the things that they're seeing?
Well, I wish they were. I think, as you said, we kind of accept it. When back in the 80s, during the Reagan era, it was a jarring sight to see homeless people on the streets, and I think we were moved to do something, and people responded with soup kitchens, food pantries, emergency kind of measures.
Right.
I don't think anyone thought we'd be here this long, and I'm afraid people have just become so accustomed to homeless people, either in sight or keeping them out of sight.
Right.
And what happens is we in the soup kitchen business and the feeding business, to me, we're kind of caught because we're serving a need. At the same time, we get so busy with providing meals, trying to raise funds. Government support has been cut. That it's hard to step back and take a look at the big picture and say, what's going on? Why are we still here?
Right.
This has to stop.
You mentioned the idea of keeping the homeless out of sight, and you mentioned Reagan. I covered the election of Reagan in 1980, and the Republican convention that year was in Detroit. And one of the big things they did, because they want to clean up the city for the GOP coming to town, was to move the homeless wholesale and get them completely out of the view of the news media and the delegates and that sort of thing. But it was like, I guess it was a little before 1980 where we had the deinstitutionalization of some of these huge mental hospitals and that sort of thing. And that's when I remember beginning to see the so-called bagmen and bag ladies in New York City. But it seems to have mushroomed since then, and it's hard not to connect that with the sea change of the Reagan administration. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there is a connection. It's hard to say. And certainly the problems of homelessness, people with mental health issues on the streets, and the current political campaign, I don't recall yet where it's even been raised as an issue of concern. People are concerned about their taxes not being risen, but the concern for poverty in general, homelessness, it's almost just off the radar.
These are not discussions as part of the national campaign. I agree. Poverty in general is not talked about.
Right.
Let's talk about your soup kitchens at Church of the Holy Apostles. The last time I talked to you, you were serving, I think, between 1,000 and 1,200 meals a day. Traditionally, they were mostly men. But when I went down there and was talking to a lot of the people who were standing online, They were not the traditional down and outers,
No.
or so. You know, so what's the population that comes to your church?
Yeah, we're not means tested, so we really take everyone. But you see some people that are chronically homeless, kind of stereotypical folks. But then a lot of people that are really working poor. They need the meal. We've had students graduate from college
Really?
that sleeping on a friend's couch until they get a job. We've had people who are immigrants to the city, and a lot of people are trying to juggle, you know, rising rents and food costs. In 2009, during the Great Recession, we actually had some men with three-breasted suits on sitting at tables that were from Wall Street, and never thought in their wildest dreams, they'd be in a soup kitchen line.
So if you see, for example, someone who's lost a job on Wall Street, or someone who's a student, even a student who hasn't yet been employed, or a man who's looking for a job, I think most Americans think, well, these are not folks, they're having a tough time economically, but they're not missing meals. How extensive is the problem of hunger in New York City?
Well, the numbers show that we call hunger food insecurity, which basically means folks can come in and out of the lack of having access to good food and food in general. So the latest surveys show about 1.4 million New Yorkers. That's the equivalent of the city of Seattle, Washington, and Columbus, Ohio combined. It's a staggering number.
I mean, that's an incredible number. I mean, if you think the population of New York is roughly 8 million people, 1.2 of them at some point in time has trouble finding enough to eat.
Exactly.
Oh.
It's staggering.
Okay.
And people will come in and out of needing food. Some people chronically, some people go through a rough time. There's rising rent. There's a medical bill to be paid. Could be any number of reasons. A lot of working poor. They're not getting a livable wage.
So if it's the 25th or the 26th of the month and the money has just run out, what are you going to do if you can't go to a soup kitchen?
So I think more and more people I see, poverty is becoming, to a lot of people, less about them and more about us, because so many of us really are just a paycheck away from needing the kind of assistance we give.
I saw a statistic recently from the Pew Research Center that said nearly 40% of all black children in this country are growing up poor. 1 out of 5 American children across the board are growing up poor. Do you think that most Americans realize how serious this situation is?
I think it's hidden. It's hidden. Hunger's hidden. Homelessness, the benches in Port Authority, in Penn Station are gone. The new benches, at least in my neighborhood in Chelsea, they have dividers in the middle of them, so you can't sleep
on them.
Exactly.
What has surprised me, since it's gone on for such a long period of time, are the people who are actually suffering. I mean, we've got joblessness. I think the official statistics give a skewed picture of what's really going on in terms of employment. But you have joblessness, you have a tremendous amount of low-wage employment, you have the poverty and the homelessness that we've been talking about. But we haven't seen the anger coming even from the people who are suffering. So I read history and I hear about these uprisings that happened, for example, during the Depression and other periods and stuff, but we don't see that. Do you have any insight, either from talking to people in your congregation or otherwise, as to why there's not more anger?
I wish there was. There should be.
You wish there was more anger.
More anger. There needs to be a sense of moral outrage that this is not the society we want to be.
Right.
I remember back in 1981, there was a cult classic, Escape from New York. And in 1980, I think there were a little bit over 1,800 murders in New York City. So looking into the future, Manhattan became a penal colony. And I think looking at Manhattan now, we're in the shadow of Hudson Yards and new development. It'd be Escape from New York, but the Escape from New York would be, the working poor, working class, even middle class, where Manhattan becomes a gated community. again, perfectly geographically situated for people to use cards to gain access.
It's becoming that kind of a city because you almost have to be wealthy in order to have any kind of comfortable life in New York City. People talked about Manhattan for a long time, but even Brooklyn now, large parts of Brooklyn are unaffordable to ordinary families. Certainly for, I came into New York as a young reporter. I wasn't making a lot of money, and it was back in the 1970s. It was pretty easy to make your way in this town. It was an affordable town, but it's not. It's not like that anymore.
No more. And I think that's why we see some people on the soup kitchen line, and who are students, who are people with education, people with some skills, but they just can't make it.
Right. So going back to Reagan became president in January 1981. And there was a deliberate sea change in the approach to social services, the delivery of social services. And so what we saw were cuts in services and a shift in attitudes that we're not going to, I guess the attitude of conservatives were that some people were getting a free ride and they weren't going to get it anymore. You were on the scene then. What was the immediate impact of that?
Well, I think this ties into your question before about the lack of outrage about the situation. In one sense, I think Reagan won because the private sector, a lot of churches, synagogues, private organizations are trying to do the best they can to kind of serve people with such basic things like food, like shelter. And by doing that, we have kind of lost that sense of really questioning policy, questioning why this is happening. So I hope in time that people will have a sense that this is no longer acceptable, this is really wrong. In the meanwhile, we're in a trap.
Right.
We've been trapped. And it's hard to get out of it.
But Reagan and other conservatives wanted the private sector to take over the delivery of services.
Exactly.
But explain why that's not feasible. We've had a lot of evidence that that's not working. Explain why you can't just have what they think of as charities meeting the needs of people.
Right. Yeah, part of it is that the federal, the dollars aren't there for one thing. Our budget is less than 8% government money. We have to raise the money ourselves. Second thing, there's just a vast array of what people need that private sector can't provide. Affordable housing, livable wages. Those are policy issues.
So it has to, only the federal government has the clout and the resources
to do that.
How'd you get in this business?
Good question. I've always had, I used to live with Dorothy Day in the Catholic Worker Movement on the Lower East Side, and I think that experience for me really saw the integration of faith and charity and justice. Justice is important, and that's always stayed with me. And Holy Apostles was one of those parishes that always took this very seriously. It started a Sunday school for immigrants. It was rumored to be a stop on the Underground Railroad. After the Stonewall riots, it was one of the few places where emergent LGBT groups could meet. And now we run the biggest soup kitchen in New York. So to me, that's part of my faith, our faith. But I think the trap is, again, is that, as St. Augustine said, charity is no substitute for justice denied. And that's what worries me most about the situation. We have to raise a lot of money. We provide people with feel-good stories because we need the bucks coming in just to stay open. But how do you pressure the system? How do you get people discontent enough to say, we should not be here?
So the idea being that you would provide these services or charity, if that's the term people want to use, as you mentioned before, temporarily. Justice is supposed to kick in at some point, and the charity is no longer supposed to be needed.
Exactly.
But that's not what's been happening.
No, that's not what's happening. And I think also what we try to do is, besides serving food, we call people to come guests, and we take that seriously. We meet in the sanctuary of the church. There's music. Guests play the piano.
I was there when the piano was playing.
It's incredible.
It was great.
So it's a welcoming. It's a sense of dignity and respect.
Yeah.
So there's a community there, which makes a big difference to folks. People are more than a collection of needs.
Right. We were talking off air, and you mentioned that you had grown up in New Jersey, as I did. How and when did you know that you wanted to be a priest?
I would say during high school, I had some clergy in my family, and it was always something that really attracted me. Questioned it during college, of course. I've never, doubted it. It feels like a vocation, and I think one of the wonderful things about being a priest and a clergyman in the situation I'm at is the church has been one of those institutions that's really been doing this kind of work for a very long time, and we do have a voice,
right.
Not like it used to be. We have to find ways to raise it.
You mentioned young people. In some
Right.
cases, young
Right.
people are coming to your soup kitchen.
Right.
It's very difficult, and I've written about this, for a lot of young people to get a foothold on a decent standard of living now. Even the kids with a good
Right.
4-year college degree, jobs are difficult to come by. You
Right.
mentioned housing is frequently not affordable, not
Right.
available in that sort of thing. What are you seeing? You have, I think, 3 children of your own.
Right.
What are you
Right.
seeing in terms of their generation? The last time I talked to you, they were college age.
Right. Right.
And with them and with their peers, what's the landscape like?
I think they're trying to delay. They're trying to stay in college and studies as long as possible because the job market is pretty bleak right now.
Right.
So I think they're finding ways to extend it, and they're exploring ways. I mean, they're also concerned, as I am, about the same kind of issues. One of my daughters is volunteering in Miami for a year with City Works, teaching inner city kids, but it's bleak. It's bleak. About half our volunteers at the soup kitchen are people in their 20s and 30s.
Is that right?
So there's a real sense of community service that's very, very strong.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very strong. And hopefully, along with that sense of community service, there's also going to be a questioning of why people are homeless, why are people poor.
Right. It's interesting because you talk about the sense of community, and one of the questions I was going to ask is sort of just the opposite of that. For a lot of public officials, conservative public officials, but a good portion of the population, when they talk about the poor or people in difficult circumstances, when they talk about the homeless, kids who are struggling in school, the attitude is that it's their fault, that they would be fine if they would only try a little harder. Right. They ought to work harder. They ought to stop drinking or stop taking drugs. The idea being that it's their fault rather than a community coming together and let's see if we can help a member of our community. Is that just sort of a natural way of thinking, or do you have any sense of why that kind of thinking has gotten such a stranglehold on our society?
Well, I think that strain's always been in American history. It's part of our culture. You could look back in history, the worthy poor, the unworthy poor.
The rugged individual.
The rugged individual. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Right. And then you have another tradition, which is more pulling together a community. It's amazing to me how some people that have gone through the Depression, for instance, will go through an experience and they'll come through that. And some folks will say, well, I made it, so they can make it, while somebody else may go through and say, boy, that was hard. I want to help other people go through a hard time. What makes one person respond one way, one the other? Hard to say.
Well, it's interesting when you mentioned the young volunteers, because one of the things that I've been thinking, sort of when I give these speeches on college campuses, I don't want to create a sense of despair. So I'm trying to figure out what there is to be hopeful about. A lot of young people are taking these issues seriously.
They are.
They speak in terms of a sense of community. Right. And it may be that because they're having a tough time getting started, it may be that we'll see a cultural shift. I mean, I would keep my fingers crossed and hope so.
Yeah, I would hope so too, and we do. As I said, we have half the volunteers we get on any day, and that's 50 to 60 folks. Usually people in their 20s and 60s. A lot of European students come who are fascinating, and we get more Scandinavian press than we get American press. I've had Moscow TV 4 times.
American media won't cover
that.
No,
they don't. Or just the holidays, you know.
Thanksgiving turkeys, and there you go.
Of course. And I think the fascination is with countries that are more take care of folks. The whole idea that a city like New York has this problem with homeless folks. It's fascinating, but they're also fascinated by the fact that people come together and help one another. That sense of community.
Who comes from Europe? How do they make their way to your church? What do they know? What have they heard?
A lot. We've been around for 33 years. We have groups from universities from Denmark and Sweden. Some people will now take their summer spring break, instead of getting drunk in Florida or Mexico somewhere, they'll actually come and volunteer for a week. So it is very hopeful. I see that, and people want to connect and they want to make a difference.
That's a good story.
It's a good sign.
If I was still doing TV news or something like that, I'd get a crew together and cover visitors to the U.S. who are sort of looking at issues of hunger, poverty, homelessness, and that sort of thing. So let's make you the czar. Now
Russia's not held in such high regard these days, but.
You now can just sort of take whatever steps you think in terms of policy would be necessary, and the funding is going to be available to address some of these very tough issues. Where would you start? What are some of the things you'd do?
Well, undergirding policy things, and that would be, affordable housing, really providing housing.
Which also would provide jobs if you began to create housing.
Exactly, and then livable wage. There's a movement now for $15 nationally an hour, $20 in New York. All those things are important, and good people are doing a lot of good things. But underneath all that, I think there needs to be this the sense that we're not going to be satisfied with what's going on now. There has to be underneath that this real discontent that says, no, we don't want to see fellow citizens on the street. We don't want to see fellow citizens working 40 plus hours a week and not being able to afford an apartment.
Right.
That has to undergird it. Otherwise, policies can be discussed, but there's not that sense of fire for kind of a social movement to really make a difference.
All right. I wish we could talk more. I want to thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate it. Father Glenn Chalmers, Church of the Holy Apostles.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. According to the New York Times, just 158 families have provided close to half of all the money raised so far for our presidential race. Democracy becomes all but meaningless when such a tiny group has such an overwhelming influence in the election of our president. After all, there are more than 300 million people in the United States. The Times points out that this tiny group of staggeringly wealthy donors is overwhelmingly white, older, and male. Their interests tend to be quite different from those of women, the young, the black, and the brown. Not surprisingly, these donors favor policies that would enhance their wealth. They want to cut taxes for the rich and spend as little public money as possible on everybody else. They are not big fans of government services for ordinary Americans. Frankly, they are not very big champions of democracy. A democracy is a system of government in which power is vested in all the people and exercised by their freely elected representatives. A plutocracy is a government or society ruled by the wealthy. We were once the world's most successful democracy. Now, with each passing day and each enormous outlay of campaign cash by our millionaires and billionaires, we are moving closer and closer to a genuine plutocracy. Nothing good can come of that. That's all for now. See you next time.